Wake up, wake up, the Ice Age is coming, the Ice Age is coming, get the fur coats out of the closet. That's the message that the world-renowned atmospheric scientist, the Polish professor Zbigniew Jaworowski, chairman of the Scientific Council of the Central Laboratory for Radiological Protection in Warsaw, presented to the world in his 2003 paper with the title "The Ice Age is Coming." He warned that the transition to the next glaciation period is already 500 years overdue and can start quickly without warning and might be as short as 1 to 2 years. He couldn't say more because the forces that are driving the Ice Age dynamics had not been discovered at his time in 2003. The scientific foundation for making the relevant discoveries hadn't been established then. And even now, the discoveries that were made are largely ignored. The world is living in the dark in this respect. The prevailing theories at the time of what causes the Ice Ages were so far off the mark that Jaworowski didn't even bother to refer to them in his paper on the Ice Age. Until the early 2000s, when space exploration opened a new window to the universe, the prevailing Ice Age theories had been guesswork. The most prominent of these was the orbital cycle theories that had been developed in the 1920s, nearly 100 years ago. The mathematician Milutin Milankovitch had theorized at that time for the lack of real data or for other constraints that ice ages might be caused by the combined effect of variations in the eccentricity, axial tilt, and precession of the Earth's orbit around the Sun, which he theorized would result in cyclical variation of solar radiation affecting the Earth. While he failed to realize that the total energy that is received on the Earth is always the same, regardless of the orientation of the Earth's spin axis, which affects only hemispheric distribution. And he also ignored what Johannes Kepler had already stated in the 1600s, that the changing eccentricity of the Earth's orbit around the Sun does not affect the total energy received in any way, but affects only seasonal distribution. Milankovich's theory was nevertheless hailed and became the mainstream theory. The fact is that astrophysical science has been latching onto straws for a very long time in attempts to rationalize the occurrence of ice ages as mechanistic phenomena, which they are not, because mechanistic ice ages are not physically possible. And now, 100 years later, thanks to modern technology, we have physically measured evidence on hand that proves conclusively that ice ages are caused by the Sun, directly and exclusively. No guesswork enters the scene. Orbital cycles, ocean current fluctuations, and CO2 and so on don't play a role. The ice ages are caused by the Sun, period. The evidence is hard and conclusive, though it is typically ignored in the science communities. The evidence that is laid up in ice exists in the form of changing production rates of the isotope beryllium-10 that is generated on the Earth by the sun. The beryllium-10 production rate can be measured. It varies in lockstep with solar activity. This means that historic beryllium-10 ratios can be measured as a proxy for historic solar activity. The consistently high beryllium production rate throughout the previous glacial period, but not before or after, proves that the previous glacial period, termed the Ice Age, was not caused by orbital mechanistics, but was caused by the sun directly, so that we can say with scientific certainty that the sun causes the ice ages and nothing else does. By working in the dark, without a clue of what actually is happening, by ignoring the measured physical evidence, some scientists still predict that the next ice age won't start for another 50,000 years. Some even say that man-made global warming will overpower the ice age dynamics, as if we had the power to affect the sun. With these types of denials of reality, the scientific community has put itself asleep, and humanity with it almost universally. And more than that, the scientific ignorance endangers the whole of humanity, as it thereby prevents society from building itself the technological infrastructures that are needed for continued human existence during the ice planet phase of the Earth. A story is told that back in the 1800s, a traveler in the Alps had noted giant boulders in a valley. The boulders seemed oddly out of place. The traveler was puzzled by how they got there. When he questioned nearby villagers, he was told to look at the distant high glaciers in the mountains. They told him that the glaciers had once extended down into the valley during the cold times and had left the boulders behind when they melted. With this discovery, an interest was roused in large-scale glaciation phenomena that can have such an amazing effect. The glaciation period that the villagers spoke of had evidently been that of the Little Ice Age of the 1600s. We know today that the Little Ice Age had been a period of extremely weak solar activity. We also know that the climate had been so cold in those days that rivers became skating rinks and agriculture diminished so extensively that between 10% to 30% of the population in Europe had perished by starvation, depending on location. This harsh period of cold, which had spanned more than a century, had nevertheless been but a fringe effect on the path to the Big Ice Age, to the big, deep glaciation period that typically spans 90,000 years. No one in the 1600s could have imagined what a full Ice Age has in store for humanity, which would have paled the harshness of the time into insignificance. We know a little more today along this line. By analyzing the content of the ice of the great ice sheets in Greenland, it became scientifically possible to measure the past in retrospect and to reach far back in time. It became apparent in ice core records that the cooling of the Earth during the last glaciation period had been 40 times more extensive than the Little Ice Age cooling had been, which had extended high mountain glaciers into a Swiss valley. It also became apparent in the ice core records that the precipitation on Earth had been 80% less during glaciation time than it is today. What you see here are real physical measurements, carefully plotted, meticulously produced, and the numbers are big. It is almost impossible to imagine what those big numbers are telling us. Who can fathom, for example, the consequences of a 70% weaker sun? For starters, the livable zone shrinks to the latitudes of the tropics. And the 80% loss of precipitation means that nearly the entire zone that remains livable on our planet becomes a desert. That's the type of situation that we will face from the 2050s onward. That is what we need to get ready for. The livable zone is the zone that can be made livable with a large-scale technological infrastructure building, which can be built extensive enough to accommodate our 7 billion world population. This means that we need to build us a completely new world in which the Ice Age cannot affect us, and that we get this completed in 30 years, which we still have remaining of the interglacial climate. It can be stated with a fairly high degree of certainty, based on events, measurements, and numerous forms of evidence, that the phase shift to the next period of full glaciation is potentially as near as the 2050s, if not closer, perhaps even as close as 30 years from now. The crucial factor, of course, is the timing. The time frame for the phase shift to be happening in the 2050s was not pulled out of a hat. It is the composite result of numerous events and measurements that all point to the 2050s in their own unique way. For example, as measured in space, the solar wind pressure began to diminish from the year 2000 on, or slightly sooner, at a rate of 30% per decade, and likewise the solar magnetic field, while the solar cosmic ray flux was increasing. If one projects these measurements forward, the solar wind will stop in the 2030s, and the sun's temperature will diminish thereafter till the Ice Age phase shift happens, with which the interglacial ends. The Ice Age phase shift is the result of a threshold condition on the weakening slope of the solar system, beyond which begins a new cold world, a world of an ice planet Earth with a hibernating sun. The phase shift causes a climate collapse, as it did 120,000 years ago, when the previous Ice Age began. The phase shift away from the current interglacial period is determined by the turn-off level for the high-powered sun. The turn-off occurs at a lower level than the turn-on. Greater plasma density is required to form the magnetic fields that focus dense plasma onto our sun than it is needed to maintain them. The delayed turn-off puts the turn-off point onto a steeper slope, where the weakening of the sun happens ever more rapidly before the turn-off. We can tell that we get near the turn-off phase shift when the fringe effects increase dramatically. The fringe effects of the weakening sun began 5,000 years ago, when the interglacial climate began to weaken. Then, 3,000 years ago, the climate warming pulses and their intervals started to diminish likewise. After that, 1,000 years ago, the climate minimum events became weaker too, and their intervals shorter. More recently, after the year 2000, or slightly before it, the solar wind pressure began to weaken at the amazing fast rate of 30% per decade. And so did the sun's underlying magnetic field, as it was measured by the Ulysses spacecraft. In the same time frame, till the end of the Ulysses mission in 2008, a cosmic ray flux increase of 20% was measured. Also, in the same time frame, the solar cycle heartbeat began to slow down from 11 years per cycle to 13 years per cycle. And more recently, in 2013, the sun's North Pole magnetic field failed to materialize in the process of polarity reversal. These are big fringe effects, and they are happening. They are not fantasies. They are measured events that have occurred, and we see more and more of them. We have measured the solar activity diminishing for 800 years towards the 1700s, measured in carbon-14 isotope ratios. And for the time frame thereafter, we have measured an up-ramping in solar activity for almost 300 years, with which the sun gave us the famous years of global warming as a solar event. We also see evidence that the up-ramping of the sun from 1715 onward was caused by the cyclical occurrence of the big historic warming spikes, which have been getting progressively smaller for 3,000 years already, and as I said, with shorter intervals between them. It became measurable too in the 1990s that we are over the hump of the global warming uplift in solar activity that got us out of the little ice age. We are now on the downslope of the pulse that had rescued us. We are nearly half the way down the slope, and we have measured the solar activity dropping off like a falling stone. With the solar wind pressure diminishing at 30% per decade from 1998 on, we find us already halfway along the path to the 0 point, with the fringe effects increasing accordingly. As I said before, past the 0 point in solar wind pressure from the 2030s onward, any further weakening of the solar system will necessarily be expressed in the sun's surface temperature beginning to diminish, towards the inhabitable phase shift at which the magnetic fields collapse that focus plasma onto the sun. When this happens, the sun falls back to its hibernation mode, a kind of default mode, a low activity mode that produces 70% less radiated energy. The phase shift is inevitable, It has happened before by the cosmic principles involved, and it will happen again. Only the exact year is somewhat uncertain. The timing is determined by the threshold level at which the magnetic fields collapse, which presently focus high-density plasma onto the Sun. The threshold line determines the turn-on point and the turn-off timing for the high-powered period of the Sun, its high-activity period, which generates the interglacial climate on Earth. The rapid weakening that we now see evident in so many ways in the solar system, as diminishing solar wind, diminishing sunspot numbers, slowing solar cycles, and fading magnetic fields, and so on, indicates that we are quite close to the turn-off point. These things are happening now, not 1,000 years from now. Global cooling, floods, storms, droughts are all increasing at a rapid rate and will continue to increase for 30 more years, with ever more crop failures along the way, until the phase shift happens and the Earth becomes uninhabitable completely, without massive technological infrastructures, such as floating into agriculture with artificial environments that have the power to supply the human need for 7 billion people effectively on an otherwise uninhabitable planet. When the Earth becomes uninhabitable in the 2050s, when the zone for the new world to be built shrinks to the band of the tropics, when the territories of Canada, Europe, Russia, the USA, China, and parts of India become unsuitable for human living, and the remaining areas becomes disabled by drought, then the pages of history take on a new color, and new pages become written as the physical foundation for our existence shifts almost entirely from living off the land to living by technologically created resources, with much of those located on the sea. A crisis in history unfolds at the present stage because the artificial resources for continued human living need yet to be developed, which is totally ignored, and the infrastructures need to be fully operational when the phase shift happens. We are at an existential crisis, therefore, because the development of these existentially critical resources is not even considered anywhere in the world, much less is it being implemented. The building of the infrastructures for the required new resources should have already started. It needs to start now. It needs to be implemented faster than the interglacial system is diminishing. But nothing is being done. The creative and productive giant that humanity inherently is, that it has the potential to be, is asleep. Even its children are asleep. Our world is comparable to a city located downstream from a great dam that is in the process of breaking up. Deep fissures appeared. The fissures are getting larger. Fountains of water are spewing forth from the bigger ones. A concerned person stands in the hustings, suggesting to everyone that they band together and build a new city on higher ground, where the breaking of the dam could not affect them. In our modern world, many would come to hear the warning, but no one would be interested enough to put a spade into the ground to start building. In the story, Some said that they didn't have the time, that they had a business to run, a wedding to prepare, a farm to tend to, and a bakery, a butchery, and an automobile repair shop to operate. Most refused to even acknowledge that the dam is breaking up, and those who are able to see the obvious said that the breaking of the dam isn't their concern and refused to get involved. "But you are involved," argued the man back from the hustings. "No one is not involved. One is either involved in saving the people of the city by relocating it, or one is involved in assuring the death of everyone in the city with the breaking of the dam, which is the result of doing nothing. Non-involvement is simply not possible in this case." The outcome of the story remains yet to be told. It is our story. It is the story of the current world. The ice age is close to be breaking upon us. The evidence is already being felt with ever more severe fringe effects in the form of floods, droughts, tornadoes, hurricanes, freezing cold, even earthquakes. Some call the effects the effect of global warming. Others say that the effects are temporary effects of a mini ice age, or a grand solar minimum that will come and pass by as it did in the 1600s. No one wants to hear the word ice age being spoken seriously. Society loves its dreaming, as it is told that a real ice age won't be happening yet for 1,000 years to come. Consequently, nothing gets started to stay on track with the universe. Nothing gets done that is vital for our continued existence. There is not enough love left in society for its humanity to bridge the many gaps of denials. Humanity is riding the merry-go-round of trivial pursuits while its future slips out of its reach. Against this background of the now fast unfolding existential crisis in civilization that humanity has become indifferent to, I have made a number of extensive efforts to explore the science of the Ice Age dynamics, and have presented the results in the form of numerous video productions. The video that is presented here is designed as an overview, but one that is extensively indexed in the transcript pages to the previously produced videos that explore the numerous aspects of the Ice Age dynamics. I have chosen the metaphor of the carousel to hint that in Ice Age explorations, new vistas come into view as the carousel rotates. I also need to add that I do not present my videos as Ice Age scare stories. I aim to uplift the Ice Age challenge to the level of a bugle call to us by the universe to rouse us to build us a new world with technological infrastructures that the glaciation consequences cannot affect. This we can most certainly do, and thereby end up richer and more secure, with a more beautiful civilization than we presently have, with greater happiness and satisfaction in living, and one that assures us a future. Most people are fast asleep today in the face of the greatest danger to their existence, just as the people in the 1600s were unaware of the scope of the cosmic dynamics when the Little Ice Age erupted that had affected their agriculture and caused widespread starvation. No one had any idea then of the great danger that the whole of humanity was in at that time, and how close the Earth had been to the phase shift to the full Ice Age, that no one was prepared for, and no one would likely have survived. It wasn't until the 2000s that ice core data from Greenland revealed that the Earth had been essentially uninhabitable during the last glaciation period. In the ice core records, the Little Ice Age shows up as half a degree of global cooling, below the 2000 average, while the full Ice Age is recorded as having been 20 degrees colder. This adds up to a 40 times deeper cooling in comparison. And more than this, the precipitation is recorded in the ice core samples as having been 80% less in glacial times than it is today. No one could have imagined this in the 1600s, much less had been prepared for it. All the lands outside the tropics, outside the pink zone, are lands that become reclaimed by the resulting immense cold under glaciation conditions. Agriculture is impossible there, and without it, human living is impossible even before the snow piles up into the deep ice sheets. And the lands within the tropics that remain ice-free under a colder and dimmer sun become total deserts, by precipitation diminishing by more than 80%. Without rain, the entire freshwater infrastructure stops. Agriculture as we know it, even in the tropics, stops for the lack of fresh water. As I said before, fortunately for us all, the sun was ramped up again in 1715 in a big way, whereby the underlying weakening to ever lower levels of solar activity and the consequent full Ice Age phase shift was prevented. This up-ramping of the sun in 1715 gave us the nearly 300 years of global warming that politics and even some scientists blame humanity for and wreck its economies to prevent it, even while this life-saving global warming was clearly caused by increased solar activity. Carbon-14 ratios stand as measurable proxies for historic solar activity, which prove that the global warming after the Little Ice Age had been caused by the sun exclusively. Regardless of the politics involved, the wonderful global warming that had lasted all the way into the 1990s had been measurably a solar event that humanity doesn't have the power to affect in any way. The cause for the solar event is built into the dynamics of the solar system as a whole. As I also said before, the cause for the uplifting of the sun that had stopped the Little Ice Age and gave us global warming instead was the dynamic continuation of the three big historic climate warming pulses. As these pulses have been getting progressively smaller in amplitude, the intervals between them have been getting progressively shorter. The intervals had diminished from 1300 years to 1100 years and then to 800 years. It was the last event in the series that saved the world in 1715. Without it, none of us would likely exist today. No one can live without food. When glaciation begins, agriculture ends as we know it. It ceases to be possible. This means that food production stops globally under glaciation conditions. The world population that came out of the last ice age, the few who survived in isolated pockets, probably lived off fish, which is possible for a minuscule population, but is evidently precarious. Ice ages in the past have been so harsh that humanity nearly became extinct during the second last ice age. Evidently, humanity didn't fare much better during the last ice age that had yielded a mere 1 to 10 million population worldwide. Now we are 7 billion people, but we have the same harsh glaciation knocking at our door, potentially in the 2050s, that humanity had barely survived in extremely small numbers. Obviously, we want to do much better than that. All that we have become, the entire development of civilization, occurred in the current interglacial period, the current period between the glacial periods. Never before in history has humanity had a 7,000 million world population, which it cannot allow to dwindle back to the 1 million level. We have the capability and the resources to build us a new world in the tropics that the Ice Age cannot touch. We can accomplish this with the most modern types of technological infrastructures with which we can support us with a richer and more powerful civilization. But nothing of this sort is even considered, much less is it being implemented. For meeting the Ice Age challenge, we need to build 6,000 new cities for 1 million people each, deep in the tropics, preferably along the equator, with new agriculture attached to them that is large enough to nourish 7 billion people. And since suitable land is scarce in the tropics, the new infrastructures will need to be placed afloat across the equatorial seas. That's the challenge. It is not a small step to meet this challenge. But why should we fail on this front? The prospects that we find on this front are tremendous. Building a new world across the seas with new cities and new agriculture is an open door to greater prosperity and happiness than we have today. All this is imminently achievable. Why then would anyone opt for death by starvation by doing nothing to prevent it, when a richer world than yet imagined lays within our grasp? Let's reach for it and live. The barrier that presently blocks the path to a secure Ice Age world is not a physical barrier, but is a political one. The science that would enable society to understand the Ice Age dynamics and its potential startup in roughly 30 years is at the present time politically blocked. It is blocked by an ideological project that is designed to keep a dying and corrupt imperial system alive that cannot maintain itself by its own resources but relies on stealing. Its goal is to stop the march of science by all means possible for the purpose of keeping humanity impotent. H.G. Wells wrote the script for the process, thinly veiled in his novel The Time Machine. The story of the novel takes its hero, an inventor of a time machine, far into the future. There he encounters an elegant but docile people named the Eloi. The Eloi are the former noble elite living in an idyllic world with plenty of food, who have no need to produce anything. The traveler also discovers what keeps this world running. He discovers the Morlock, the equivalent of the Industrial Scientific Society, the masters of machinery who operate the productive processes. The traveler discovers their secret. The science and technology people keep the Eloi as livestock. Wells's message was to the elite not to allow science to gain the upper hand, or else these practical science people will eat you for breakfast. There was a debate on the subject in the 1920s as to how to deal with science. Apparently, it was decided that science can be effectively crippled with irrationality and thereby be controlled. Shortly thereafter, the hydrogen fusion sun doctrine was invented, of a sun that is its own master. And a bit later, the Big Bang doctrine was invented to support the hydrogen gas sun doctrine. The Big Bang was said to have created the hydrogen for that sun. With this two-pronged devil's fork established, a foundation was set up for the doctrine on which the invariable solar constant, as it was called, could be sold to society. The doctrine so established effectively turned the lights out in the realm of astrophysical science. Climate change was blamed on humanity. The ice ages were rendered by the doctrine of the constant sun a purely mechanistic phenomenon. As I said before, the ice ages were deemed to be the result of numerous minute variables of the orbits of the Earth, all interacting, all measured in tens of thousands of years. This devil's fork came out of the 1920s, during the decade of the great debate of how to deal with science. The man-made global warming project was added 50 years later in the 1970s. With the devil's fork worshipped in astrophysics as a god, the Ice Age subject was rendered to be of no concern to anyone. The subject was closed. The elite's great fear evidently was that if the Ice Age cat was to slip out of the bag, especially the fact that the next ice age is imminent, the worldwide economic development that the recognition would spark would end the power of the noble elite forever, which has no foundation to exist in a developing world. Consequently, the scientific aspects of the Ice Age dynamics have remained artfully hidden from society in order that the imperial oligarchic elite of the world would be able to continue to exist as in olden times, powered by slavery, looting and stealing, which accumulates wealth and fosters impotence in society, and which also keeps the world in turmoil, with wars and famines, towards the self-destruction of society. The critical Ice Age recognition is therefore kept out of sight on this basis and is ridiculed and denied. Obviously, it was understood by the elite that whenever the Ice Age recognition came to the surface, it would have to be squashed by all means possible. This resulted in the big project in the 1970s, with which the man-made global warming doctrine was launched. The growing scientific concern at the time about the coming ice age that had surfaced was quickly pushed back out of sight with the man-made global warming doctrine, and was kept out of sight successfully to the present day. An answer began to develop with the discovery of the natural principle in electrodynamics that enables the recognition of the sun as a sphere of plasma that responds to electric force principles instead of being a sphere of atomic gas that is ruled by gravity alone. Because a sphere of atomic gas of the size of the sun, or even larger spheres, cannot actually exist. Such spheres would far exceed the gas compression limit. And if a gas sphere of the size of the sun could magically exist, it would be 1,000 times heavier than it is known to be. But as it is, all the known parameters about the sun, none of which fit a gas sphere, match the characteristics of a plasma sun. A plasma sun is an extremely variable star by its very operating principle. It is not its own master, but merely responds to changing external conditions, and it responds quickly. Some of its responses, now that the solar system is getting weaker, cause enormously large effects on the Earth, such as flooding, droughts, blizzards, freezing, and so on. Since the sun is externally powered, with plasma interaction on its surface, the obvious question is, how is this possible? A number of theories were developed. One of these is the electric sun theory. The theory seemed reasonable, except for a fundamental impossibility. The electric sun theory has electrons flowing into the sun that generate heat and light in an electric arc type interaction. But this isn't possible on a continuous basis. The electrons flowing into the sun would pile up and clog the reaction process. A sink effect is needed, like an open faucet. The open faucet enables water to flow. It enables the dynamics of flow. Every dynamic flow process requires a source and a sink. The electric sun theory doesn't incorporate the critical continuous sink effect, but the plasma sun does. The plasma sun, in comparison, is powered by inflowing plasma streams that are bound up on the surface of the sun into atomic elements that are electrically neutral and flow away with the wind. The atomic synthesis provides the sink effect. The plasma that flows into the atomic synthesis no longer exists in the electrically organized plasma environment, as if it had exited the universe. In this manner, the plasma sun consumes plasma. The atomic synthesis is the open faucet in this comparison. Its plasma consumption enables interstellar plasma streams to form and to flow. By being electrically neutral, the created atoms are no longer a part of the landscape of electric forces. They are free to flow into space, typically with the solar wind. And they do so massively. All the planets in the solar system were created in this manner over time. The plasma-consuming zinc effect keeps the plasma streams in motion, flowing into the sun forever and ever. The plasma sun is a sphere of plasma that is largely hollow inside. In extremely large spheres of plasma, gravity begins to play a role, which affects the dynamics of the plasma that is always in motion. Plasma is made up of protons and electrons, which carry a positive and negative electric charge, respectively. Particles of opposite charge attract one another with the electric force, and those of like charge repel one another. By this electric principle, the negative electrons are drawn to the positive protons with the electric force that is one of the strongest forces in the universe. But before an electron can latch itself onto a proton, an even stronger force repels the electron again, only to be attracted anew. With the electrons being 1,000 times smaller than the protons, the electrons become drawn into an endless dance of attraction and repulsion, swarming around the protons. This swarming effect also enables the protons to be more densely packed to each other. However, in very large spheres of plasma, where gravity also begins to play a role, the lighter electrons tend to swarm away from the center of gravity towards the surface. The migration of the swarming electrons towards the surface enables the protons at the core to repel each other more strongly. The end result is that a plasma sphere has the least mass density at its center and the greatest mass density at its surface, which is the very opposite characteristic of a gas sphere. Enormously large plasma structures can be formed this way, which in the extreme become large hollow shells. A sun needs to have an extremely large surface area in order to be able to emit large volumes of radiated energy. In addition, a plasma sphere also has an extremely high electron density at its surface. This density is so great that it attracts interstellar plasma to it and strongly reacts with it. It is, in principle, impossible for a large plasma sphere not to be a sun. But the process doesn't stop at this stage. When large volumes of plasma flow in cosmic space, the magnetic fields that the movement of the electric particles create pinch the moving plasma streams together into ever tighter concentrations. The pinch effect, of course, increases the magnetic concentration likewise, which in turn increases the pinching effect ever more. Here things become interesting. Researchers at the Los Alamos National Laboratory had conducted a series of high-energy discharge experiments in order to discover what physical shapes result when the magnetic pinching effect becomes so extreme that the plasma particles literally flow into each other from all sides, with nowhere to go. In such cases, different physical principles come into play that force the plasma and its magnetic field to fold backwards into a dome into a dome-like structure where the plasma becomes superconcentrated until the pressure becomes intense enough for it to break out of the confinement into a thin stream that forms a ring-like structure of 56 rotating filaments of hyperdense plasma. In the experiment, the super-intense magnetic field also generated a toroidal structure around the thin stream. The energy dissipation that results enables the now weakened plasma stream in the experiment to expand again in the reverse order of the process. In a few cases in cosmic space, toroidal structures are visible. We see an example in the form of a halo around the equator of Jupiter. The rings extend away from it, along the planet's ecliptic. The toroidal structure also appears to have been faintly apparent around the Sun, as it is shown here, though the image may be an artist's impression. In the case of the Sun, it is the heliospheric current sheet that extends outward from it, like Jupiter's rings. The current sheet flowing from the Sun extends for 15 billion kilometers, all the way to the edge of the heliosphere. Close to the plasma stream, the heliospheric current sheet is aligned with the equator of the Sun, in the place of the toroidal ring in the experiment. And further out, it becomes aligned with the ecliptic of the solar system. In the case of the Sun itself would likely be located within the hyperconcentrated plasma stream that extends between the complementary magnetic structures, as was replicated in laboratory experiments. The plasma researcher David Lapointe termed the dynamically self-forming magnetic structures in large plasma streams the primal fields. In space, the primal fields form dynamically and concentrate plasma around the Sun. In order to explore the magnetic field's characteristics in the small, David Lapointe manufactured himself a set of permanent magnets of the shape that the natural dynamics would form. With these replicas, he was able to replicate in principle the powering of a sun and explore features related to the process, all with a tabletop experiment. The features that were discovered with the two diverse types of laboratory experiments by Lapointe and Perrat have been subsequently discovered by NASA in space, both in the stellar scale and also in the very large form of the galactic scale that is shown here. The evidence that large plasma stream structures do exist in cosmic space, with plasma being focused onto our Sun, has been brought home by NASA's Ulysses satellite that had orbited the Sun in a polar orbit for 16 years. The Ulysses satellite had measured a sharply delineated void within the sphere of the outflowing solar wind and also magnetic fields. NASA has measured the void over the polar regions of the Sun in both hemispheres consistently at every orbit, precisely where highly concentrated plasma is flowing into the Sun, according to the experimental models. The verification in cosmic space of the plasma stream that drives plasma onto a Sun is all by itself, whereas all the efforts that went into planning and building and operating the amazingly successful Ulysses science project that extended over 30 years from start to finish. Ulysses had made the invisible visible. Plasma is not visible in space. The protons in plasma are 100,000 times smaller than the smallest atom, and the electrons are 1,000 times smaller than that. But plasma can be seen by its effects, such as by the void in the outflowing solar wind that Ulysses saw over the poles of the sun. As I said before, another visible example of plasma streams flowing in cosmic space has been seen above and below our galaxy. In this case, the plasma structures were visible in X-ray and gamma-ray light. NASA saw two large confinement dome structures existing above and below the galactic disk. The structures are large. They extend for 25,000 light years in each direction, with their shape being that of a confinement dome. Their presence illustrates that our entire galaxy is but a node point structure between intergalactic plasma streams that power the galaxies and everything within them. In this case, the galactic node point would be between extremely long plasma streams with electric resonance features within the streams measured in tens of millions of years. In a hypothetical case for our galaxy, the Milky Way galaxy, one intergalactic plasma stream might connect with the Andromeda galaxy, 2.5 million light-years distant, with a resonance cycle of 31 million years. The other stream might connect with galaxy M83, that's 12.5 million light-years distant, with 150 million years resonance. All plasma streams have built-in resonance cycles, like the strings of a piano. In both cases, the cycle times depend on the length and the density of the resonating structure. For long intergalactic plasma streams that span across millions of light years, plasma resonance times in the range of tens of millions of years are well within the range of what one would expect. But how can we make this type of theoretical plasma structure visible? We have made it visible by measuring the heavy oxygen ratio in seashells from deep ocean sediments going back in time 500 million years. The heavy oxygen ratio varies with climate temperatures, so that the measurements can be used to reconstruct the historic climate on Earth. Now look what we find there. We find there two very long climate cycles overlaid on each other. We find a 31 million year cycle and a 150 million year cycle. That's how we can see the resonance of the intergalactic plasma streams. And note what else we find. We find that our galaxy is presently at the weakest point it has been in 440 million years. That's how we can see why the Earth is presently locked into an ice age epoch, and has been so for a few million years, with the glaciation getting ever more severe. The ice ages began roughly 2 million years ago, on the long galactic downslope of the last 100 million years. And as I said, the ice ages have become progressively more severe over time. The result was that during the last 500,000 years there was so little plasma density available for the Sun that its plasma-concentrating magnetic fields could only form during the peak of the interstellar resonance in the plasma streams that connect up with our solar system. We know from ice core records from Antarctica that the peak times during which the magnetic fields form that boost the Sun to its currently high-intensity state cover only 15% of the interstellar resonance cycles, so that for the remaining 85% of the roughly 100,000-year resonance cycle for our solar system, the magnetic fields cannot form, for the lack of sufficient plasma density in the system. During those weak times when the primal fields do not form, the plasma flows less focused. It loosely flows around the Sun. Without dense plasma around it, the Sun goes into hibernation. The hibernation causes large-scale glaciation on the Earth. As I said before, the ice cores tell us that during the previous glaciation period, the global cooling had exceeded the cooling of the Little Ice Age period 40-fold. This is big. This deep cooling reflects a 70% weaker Sun, with 70% less energy being radiated. The deep reduction in solar energy being radiated corresponds to a temperature reduction on the surface of the Sun from the present 5,800 degrees Kelvin to about 4,000 degrees. Stellar mapping tells us that the vast majority of the stars in the galaxy operate in the 4,000 degrees range and slightly below it, which appears to be a kind of default level in our galaxy at the present time, as the majority of the stars in the galaxy fall into this category. Our Sun is located slightly above the edge of this category. It is not unreasonable to assume that our Sun, as a rather mediocre star that falls into the low end of the brighter category, can fall out of this category into the lower default category. We appear to be near the transition point right now for this fallout of the Sun into the lower category to happen. We have seen the interglacial climate diminishing significantly already from the interglacial optimum onward. By everything that we see happening in escalating climate anomalies, we appear to be in the final phase towards the turn-off point. And that's where the problem for humanity begins. No one in general society is even faintly aware of the vast scope of the Ice Age consequences. The big climate anomaly that now affect everyone and every country and every region, with ever more cold, snow, flooding, storms and droughts, appear on the surface as forebodings of another little ice age coming up. In real terms, they are mere escalating fringe effects that are too small to stand out on the larger scene. We still live in an interglacial climate with a few ripples happening within the interglacial environment that are only significant in relationship to the interglacial climate that we have been taught to regard as eternal rather than fragile, that we cling to as absolute globally as a society, even while our precarious interglacial climate is already collapsing. When the phase shift happens that takes us out of the interglacial environment, everything that we have experienced, even the worst anomaly, no longer applies. We will then live in a different world, with a 70% weaker sun and 80% less precipitation. The new environment spells mass death for humanity by starvation without fail, because no one can live without food, and food cannot be grown under glacial conditions when much of the Earth becomes largely an ice planet. If we have not built us a new world by the time the phase shift happens, with technological infrastructures that the Ice Age cannot touch, the whole of humanity might become extinct, as it nearly became once before, and potentially many times before that. We are the 8th human species and the only survivor through the long string of ice ages in our past. We are also the only species of humanity that developed itself into a 7 billion world population, which now faces the task for the first time in human history to maintain itself at a current level technologically through the next ice age that in previous times had enabled only a few million people to exist in isolated pockets where natural living remains possible. Ironically, it is here, at the most critical juncture in our history, that we, as the most advanced species that ever existed on this planet, have put ourselves to sleep mentally, riding the fast train to oblivion by not responding to the Ice Age challenge as if it didn't exist. We have seen in beryllium records that the climate on Earth, including the Ice Ages, are caused by the sun. We have seen the sun getting weaker over the last 5,000 years of the interglacial climate. We have seen the solar warming events diminishing rapidly. And we have seen the solar minimum events diminishing likewise almost geometrically. In addition, we now see the solar cycles diminishing too, and their heartbeat slowing down. We even see the solar wind pressure collapsing at the astonishing rate of 30% per solar cycle, and likewise the solar magnetic field. We now see the solar weakening progressing so fast that from 2013 onward, the sun lost its northern polar magnetic field completely. We have watched all these events unfolding. We know that they are real because we have measured them all, and still we close our eyes to them as if none of that had actually happened. We understand the dynamics of what we have measured and their obvious consequences. And we can project the consequences into the future to determine the potential phase shift timing, which may be as close as the 2050s. And still, we staunchly refuse to stir our stumps to get the spade into the ground to assure our future existence. We have made enormous scientific efforts to collect the data that enables us to determine the phase shift timing into the future. We also know from the acquired data that this future, that is potentially as near as 30 years from now, will unfold on an uninhabitable planet that we cannot survive unless we build us the technological infrastructures that enable our continued existence. We know from the acquired data that the near future is a death trap without the technological infrastructures for continuing human living, because the natural landscape under glaciation condition yields nothing. It becomes a world without food. But even as we know all this, we remain stuck in our beloved easy chair with an iron fist type commitment to remain stuck, to do nothing, with the very thought banished that would build us a new world in which continued human living is possible, as if human life isn't worth the necessary effort to maintain it. And our promise to our children of a bright future is as empty as we ourselves have become as a human society. That's where we stand today. This is today's report card. We have trapped ourselves into an empty, small-minded world of utter impotence, content to be living with our eyes and ears closed and our humanity banished, lest it would wake us up to embrace the world and humanity as a precious gem. We have even been taught to regard the sun as its own master, as an unchanging heat engine, while the opposite is the case. In real terms, the solar model that humanity is taught to hail like a god is so full of holes that it puts the makers of Swiss cheese to shame. But why should we remain stuck in this imprisoning box, created 100 years ago by small-minded men who were trapped in defending a dying political system? Society has grown up too far in those 100 years as to cling to such archaic science tales as the fabled dark energy that blocks light, whereby, so it is said, the sunspots appear dark at the umbra. Let the magic tales go. Close the book on magic. Also close the book on the famous magic tales of the universe having exploded out of nothing in the span of milliseconds. The real universe is much more understandable than that. The real universe is a plasma universe that is universally self-creating and self-developing, which synthesizes its own atomic elements and does so constantly. The Big Bang magic isn't needed. The Big Bang Foundation, the measured redshift that supposedly proves that the universe is exploding, is a deception, since the redshift phenomenon is merely the result of energy depletion in photons on their path across millions of light years of space and across large fields of plasma on the way. When we break out from the frame of magic in science to what is actually real, a new world comes into view with a sobering awakening. The plasma sun theory is the only solar theory that is actually physically possible and supports all known solar events and features. The theory is simple, it works, and its key features have been replicated in numerous laboratory experiments. The gas fusion sun concept, in contrast, doesn't have a workable foundation. Far from it. It is a doctrine built on magic that one is required to accept on faith, such as the electron degeneracy magic that is deemed to make a gas sun physically plausible. Even the fabled nuclear fusion energy production in the solar core is magic, which every laboratory experiment has proved to be not possible, and also has proved that nuclear fusion is an energy-consuming process. The plasma sun theory doesn't have these problems. It brings the solar system into the universe as an integral element of it. No magic is required. Every known principle supports it. And most important of all, it takes the Ice Age dynamics out of the box of magic and makes it measurable and understandable and predictable. The doctrine of the gas sun magic is the most deadly doctrine ever created. It is deadly by its doctrine of the constant sun. The constant sun myth blocks the Ice Age recognition. It prevents humanity from building itself the necessary technological new world that the Ice Age cannot touch. However, when we step away from the dark magic science into the landscape of real science, the Ice Age is not scary at all, but comes to light as a bugle call to humanity to become alive as human beings and to experience its dormant potential in the process of creating itself a new world with greater security, greater prosperity, and with cultural advances that give the terms Renaissance and happiness a new meaning, and give the very concept of a future a golden shine. So, who is afraid of the Ice Age? Not I. Who wants to live as a dead man walking, as humanity presently does? Not I. Who wants to live choked with debt and rent slavery and food prices that are reaching for the sky? Not I. I am not afraid of human development and its resulting freedom for humanity to live evermore with songs of joy on its lips for the achievements wrought. I would like to think that there are probably billions of people who would love to be part of the Ice Age Renaissance world that lays before us, who would gladly become involved in creating it if the opportunity for it existed. With this kind of future on the horizon, who in society would choose to offer their life to the war criers and die in the ditches of a destroyed world? I'd like to think that those are few and far between who opt to waste their life that way, in comparison with those who opt to come to life as human beings by experiencing the grandeur that the Ice Age world development has to offer. Just imagine being a part of the project of building 6,000 new cities for 1 million people each, on lands that do not yet exist, produced in automated industrial processes, fabricated with high-quality material that exists in infinite abundance, process-ready, sitting on the ground, processed with energy technologies that have been sitting on the shelf since the 1950s, and with fuel reserves that may never be depleted. We lack nothing but the love for one another as human beings to make the grand potential that we have a reality. I think this is the route that we will choose when we manage to wake us up from the dream world of false science magic, false politics, and false ideologies to what we are and can yet become. The time to get started is now. We have 30 years grace to get this job done. The goal is to make the grade and to earn us a AA+ on the report card when the Ice Age exam is called 30 years from now. Our success will determine whether we will live and have a future or not. Much hangs in the balance here. Fortunately, the weakening environment of the Sun enables larger volumes of the solar cosmic ray flux to be emitted, which doesn't get trapped in the less dense sphere of the plasma around it, and the resulting increase in cosmic ray events is felt on Earth, including by us, in a beneficial way. Cosmic rays are not continuous rays like rays of light, but are single events of fast-moving electrically charged particles, primarily protons. These particles are 100,000 times smaller than the atoms of our bodies. Atoms are constructs of plasma particles that are bound together into structures that comprise largely empty space. Cosmic ray particles see our biology as empty space and flow right through us without colliding with anything. However, their movement through our body leaves in the wake electric currents by magnetic induction. The electric currents appear to be beneficial for our complex neurological system that operates electrically to a large degree. The evidence is surprising. History tells us that the great cultural advances in civilization were wrought during times of cold climate, which are typically times of larger volumes of cosmic ray events occurring. Inversely, the times of warm periods, which were lean periods of cosmic ray flux, were the times of the horrible wars. I am not saying with this that the destiny of humanity is out of our hands. I am merely suggesting that a cognitively starving society has a lesser chance to develop itself than a well-nourished society. I'm bringing this point up to illustrate that we actually do have a very good chance that the needed 6,000 new cities afloat in the tropics will be built, as we are on the fast track to ever-increasing volumes of cosmic ray flux impacting the Earth and us with it. With the solar system getting weaker at a rate of 30% per decade, we are way past the cosmic ray starvation level in which the big wars happened. The age of the wars appears to be over. While the masters of empire are still rolling their war drums furiously, nothing will likely come of it. The period of the cognitive starvation has ended. A growing sense of peace and humanity is unfolding, faintly as this may be. And still another aspect of the Ice Age dynamic comes into view in the long historic sweep when we open a window back to the last Ice Age and beyond. aspects can be found there that are immediately relevant to the Ice Age challenge of our modern time. The resulting view takes us far back into a history that is largely unknown. But that's another story for another major exploration, and a necessary one, as the indifference in society in modern time goes very deep, is iron strong, and is standing in opposition to the grandest challenge in the history of humanity, which is the Ice Age challenge to society, to raise itself out of the easy chair and create itself a new Renaissance world with technological infrastructures that the Ice Age glaciation cannot touch, and which has the potential to far supersede the present stage, with greater freedoms, more abundance, deeper peace, larger security, and beauty and happiness.